backyard.
Oh, yes, the devil has been very busy in our backyard. And I can't comment on that, but you know what I mean. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner, who has hit many home runs in her lifetime. Our engineer, of course, is Vern Anderson. Well, I grew up in Baltimore and will always consider it my hometown, and tonight's show is kind of a love letter of sorts to my hometown with our guest senior editor at Baltimore Magazine, Ron Casey. Or Cassie, I just got punched in the nose there. Who has published a terrific book called If You Love Baltimore, It Will Love You Back. 171 short but true stories. I've read every one. Well, as you know, when we have books on 21st Century Radio, I read every page of every book we have. I don't care if it's 722 pages, I'll read it. It's a great book. I guarantee if you ever spent any time calling Baltimore your hometown, that I guarantee that you will love this book. I lived in the city of Baltimore for 99.9% of my life. Other places in New York, of course, California, other stuff like that. And I've painted over a dozen murals and at least that many art cars all over Baltimore. Some of my biggest supporters were the black community in and around what is called Station North, where I lived across from the Black Jack nightclub. Whoa, what a nightclub that was. And that's a story for another day, but when I was nearly murdered by some rednecks who hated anyone who affiliated with people of color. And they didn't like that I was painting a mural for the black owners of this famous club. They tried twice to get me. Now, some of my Baltimore murals have been appreciated and won awards, while some have been carelessly destroyed, including some of my very, very best, like the All-America City mural at the 5-story high tribute to Baltimore that used to grace the entrance to Locust Point until it was painted over without telling me in 2003. That's what artists in this town have to deal with all the time. This time it was by Bill Struver of Cross Street Partners. Didn't even tell me. Never talked to me. Just wiped it out. Now, one person who truly valued my work and employed me several times to commission murals throughout Baltimore was William Donald Schaefer. In my opinion, the greatest mayor Baltimore's ever had. In my opinion, I used to call him also Uncle Don. And he shared with me a secret formula for his success, and it's something I practiced ever since, and I'll share it with you later on when we get to that section when we talk about Uncle Don. And I'm sure our guest, Ron, you with us?
I'm here, yep.
How's your pitching arm, Ron?
It's out of practice.
Well, then you better get to shape here. Get ready. You only got a couple of minutes to get that arm in shape here. Now, I'm sure our guest, Ron Cassie, will agree with us when he finds out what this, because for one reason, I know he is partnered with the amazing Helen Ewan, the Director of Communications at the American Visionary Art Museum, where we last met Ron during the 50th anniversary celebration and relaunch of the Woodstock Bus. Ron Cassie is a national award-winning senior editor at Baltimore Magazine. His work has appeared as a notable selection in the best of American sports writing, in Newsweek, Huffington Post, Grist, New York Daily Times, the Baltimore Sun, Baltimore City Paper, Urban Knight, where he served as editor-in-chief prior to becoming a full-time journalist. He spent almost 2 decades swinging a hammer, rodding a buck, and pouring drinks for a living. What kind of drinks did you pour?
Mostly it was beer out of the tap. It was, places like the old Midtown in Baltimore.
Did you ever drink any of the old Baltimore beers, the Pilsners and things of that nature?
Just Natty Bo, maybe just the oldest
Well,
one.
yeah, that's not the oldest one.
Not the oldest, but I mean
Yeah,
oldest for me, I would say.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Gunther,
I
remember?
probably maybe I had a Gunther's beer back in
Yeah.
the day.
Oh, yeah. They were really something when they competed. I loved to watch them. Anyway, well, you spent two decades swinging a hammer. Why were you swinging a hammer? Were you building something?
Yeah. So not 2 decades swinging a hammer, but 2 decades swinging a hammer, pedaling a bike, or pouring drinks to earn a living. I did out of high school. I framed houses. I built houses for a number of years in up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where I went to high school. So that's where I swung a hammer.
Well, when you rode a bike, did you just ride for a couple of blocks, or did you ride? Did you ride over 100 miles?
I was a bike messenger in D.C., an old school bike messenger for 5 years, and I had a little bike messenger business in D.C., a little courier company called Mercury Messenger. So I rode every day, 8, 9, 10 hours a day, um, putting in hundreds and hundreds of miles a week for work, and then of course, yeah, going out for 100-mile bike rides on the weekend sometimes too.
I think that's extraordinary.
Yeah,
That really is. You must have
yeah.
calves the size of Venezuela. Is that right?
Uh, I must have what?
Calves.
Oh, calves. Well, I
Yeah.
did have good. My calves were used to be in pretty good shape. They were buff for sure. I mean, you gotta. It is a workout. It'll get you fit. You'll either quit or you'll get fit. One or the other will happen when you're a bike messenger.
Well, I want to welcome you to 21st Century Radio, Ron. I am eager to jump into our first story and talk about Roy Campanella.
Okay.
But let's give an overview of the book first. You impress me as someone who truly loves our city, and I want to tell you that reading these 171 stories will start anyone checking into our city will love. Absolutely. No. So, of course, you have included stories about famous Baltimoreans, but more often these stories revolve around people most of us have never heard of, giving us a picture of Baltimore and its workaday inhabitants. Really well done. Would you describe the book in an answer here before I talk to you about Roy Campanella, and then you talk to me about Roy Campanella?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think what you read a little bit about my biography is I didn't really become a full time journalist until I was 40 years old, and spent 20 years doing kind of blue collar jobs. I worked in a factory initially. I swung a hammer for a lot of years, framing houses, and I pedaled the bike, or working hard as a bike messenger, and I just had my own little business, and being a bartender in Fells Point and in Midtown, things like that. And I think naturally I'm kind of attracted to those stories that are kind of under the radar, that aren't about famous people and celebrities. And I think especially in a town like Baltimore, you meet a lot of amazing people with amazing stories, that aren't famous, that aren't as much as I love Barbara Mikulski or Elijah Cummings, or some of the Orioles and old Colts. There's everyday stories that are just fantastic, to give you real insight into the city and its history and the people that live here. I think I came here from Allentown, Pennsylvania, blue collar town in my early 20s, and I had a friend who lived in Waverly by Memorial Stadium, and I felt at home, right away. I remember having crabs for the first time, hard-shelled crabs and some beer, and walking over to Memorial Stadium, and the row houses in Waverly looked just like Allentown, except we didn't have Major League Baseball, and we didn't have the old city paper and the old WHFS radio station, or the murals, or the art cars, or kind of some of the great quirky culture, and so I felt at home and enthralled with Baltimore, like, right away. I did live in D.C. for a number of years, like I said, but Baltimore, I always call, it's not my birthplace, but it's my spiritual home.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're a great writer. You really are. I really enjoyed. That's why it was so easy to get through 300. What is this? 308? No, 86 pages, something like that. Well, Roy Campanella is one of my favorite baseball players of all time. And I loved your story about Roy Campanella's Baltimore connections, and I want to tell you that, and our audience, with some of the background of 21st Century Radio having been the major supporters of the Negro League's baseball players. We had so many difficult times with the media on this because they didn't really want to cover it, and particularly of Leon Day in Cooperstown. Now, Roy Campanella voted for Leon Day every time he had a chance, but except for one particular time, he was very ill. Leon Day was not voted in the Hall of Fame at that time, and it was very unfortunate because the reason why Campanella couldn't vote was he was ill. And that's when we learned that the Hall of Fame said, well, I'm sorry, you can't vote, Roy. That was crazy. That was absolutely crazy. And they changed their mind about that years later because I made so much noise about that. It's absolutely crazy. Did you know that Leon Day is the only pitcher who defeated Satchel Paige technically in all 4 of their head-on matchups?
I did not know that. I'm a big Leon Day fan, and I've talked to his wife. And I didn't know that, and like you, I love the Negro League baseball stories. I thought Ken Burns' documentary did a great job incorporating Negro League baseball into, the history of baseball in this country, which of course it is a part of it. And Baltimore has a really rich tradition of Negro League baseball that has largely been overlooked. And still is. And I think, you can't talk about players like Leon Day enough. And I know it's a long struggle to get like Leon Day Park here. And Baltimore has a great Negro League baseball history.
And Roy Campanella, of course, was the same, right?
Yeah. So my father was an old Brooklyn Dodgers fan.
Oh, wow. That must have been a lot of fun.
So I was born in North New Jersey. My dad was born in Newark, New Jersey. He was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. His father, my grandfather, had been a Yankees fan, a Babe Ruth fan, Yankees fan. Another little Baltimore connection here with Babe Ruth. My uncle had been a New York Giants fan, and my dad was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. So I grew up as a kid knowing all the Brooklyn Dodgers. In the entire lineup, I could name Pee Wee Reese, Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella, Junior Gilliam, Duke Snyder, Carl Furillo, Gil Hodges. I grew up with all those names and all those stories.
Wow.
I did not know until just a couple years ago that Roy Campanella had been a star in Baltimore for more than a half dozen years before he went to Brooklyn.
That's right.
And that 2 other Brooklyn Dodgers, I mean the legendary Boys of Summer, right? Mm-hmm. Junior Gilliam, Joe Black had also started in Baltimore. At one time, all 3 of those guys were playing for the Baltimore Elite Giants, and they all become, critical pieces of those, epic, iconic, legendary teams that played at Ebbets Field. Mm-hmm. And, I think there should be a monument over where, at least a historical marker over where Bugle Field used to be in East Baltimore. I think there should be a Roy Campanella statue by Camden Yards. I mean, the only reason there's statues of these Oriole players and not of these players like Roy Campanella is they weren't allowed to play in the major leagues.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge Roy Campanella fan. I knew about Roy Campanella when I was a kid from my dad. So to discover that and then to write a little story about Roy Campanella, was really a lot of fun for me. Made me feel close to my dad again.
Well, he was absolutely crushed when he was told he could not vote for Leon, and that's when Leon came to me and said, "Bob, I know you're trying to get me in the Hall of Fame, but I don't believe it. I don't think I'll ever get in there." So, but I told him I found out from others that he was going to be voted in before then, and he just would not believe it. And fortunately, he was. But he died 6 days later, which was just unbelievably bad. But, of course, Geraldine's alive, and her daughter is alive, Sarah, and their son, who taught in China and will be returning to China. And they're doing very well. Hey, but we got to take our first break here on 21st Century Radio. And as a matter of fact, friend, as I said before, you can find, no, I didn't say this before, but you can find that link pinned to the top of 21st Century Radio's Facebook. That is www.roncassie.com.
Hello there, this is George Martin, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Hey, that was Uncle George. Uncle George stopping by. We're almost finished book 2 of Yellow Submarine, of which George Martin played a big part besides the Beatles. And I'm looking forward to that being released before Christmas. Maybe it could be. Okay. If You Love Baltimore, It Will Love You Back. 171 short but true stories, Apprentice House 2020. Available on Amazon or over at www.roncassie. I'll spell that CASSIE. Of course, you can spell RON, right? That's the okay. Now, .com. And you can find that link pinned to the top of 21st Century Radio's Facebook page. So go over there right now. Go right now and become a follower today. And please subscribe to your YouTube channel, where you can listen to thousands of our shows. We've been going on here for what? How many years? Almost 40 years in this town. Okay. Are you there with us, Ron?
I'm here.
Okay. We're going to put you under arrest. Is that all right?
For a short time, yeah. Sure.
Okay, just for a short time. Of course, you don't do long arrests around here. Well, I'm sorry. I'm having such a good time. I don't mean to scare you here, because I think I know what I'm doing most of the time, except when I enjoy myself. Now,
I don't mean to throw the conversation off track, but I was in Liverpool right before COVID-19 struck.
Whoa.
Yeah, I did the Beatles tour. I went to see Paul's house, and
is that
George's
why you
house,
went?
and John Lennon's house, and Penny Lane, and Strawberry Fields.
What a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been listening to all of their music all over again, and I have just learned how much I miss them and how good they were. I had no idea. When you watch Paul sing and make all those noises, it's unbelievable that he can do that. And so well, there's something. But
well, my maternal grandparents were from Manchester. My maternal grandfather was a coal miner, and they came to the U.S. in the early 1920s. So right before COVID, I took a trip to England to visit their little row house where they were from in Manchester, and they sailed to Baltimore from Liverpool. You know, that was a big line for immigrants. A lot of European immigrants came through from Liverpool to Baltimore. There's a direct line there. Irish immigrants too.
Yeah. Well, would you introduce us to Bob Wagner and his Schwinn bicycle, in which he has traveled hundreds and thousands of miles as well?
Yeah, Bob Wagner does long distance bike rides. He's a little bit of a rambling man. He organizes really epic bike rides. The one he's famous for, and the one I've done with him, is called the Monument to Monument bike ride. It leads from the Baltimore Monument in Mount Vernon to George Washington, our George Washington Monument, the first monument to George Washington, or the predecessor to D.C. And it's a bike ride that goes to the D.C. monument and then back on the same day. So it's roughly about 50 miles each way. Wow. Maybe a little longer, give or take. It's not a competitive bike ride. It's purely recreational. It's purely fun. It gets some really, really serious cyclists, and it also gets middle-aged guys like me and Bob who really love to ride, love to go for long rides, and it's just about one of the most fun things I've ever done in Baltimore. Just a blast.
Well, I'm just so impressed by that. That is really hard work, and yet,
Bicycles. One of the first bicycles was in America was made in Baltimore, and bicycles are kind of like the perfect machine for human beings, a perfect human-powered machine. They just, when we're little kids, we can get on there and go forever. Our legs are just made out of rubber. But even as adults, you can go surprisingly a long ways on a bike. And Bob's love for riding. He grew up in Towson. And his love for riding came in the 1970s. He, 70s kid wearing tube socks and short shorts and sneakers, no helmet in those days, no Lycra gear. He would just leave the house and like I grew up in the 70s and would say, Mom would say, just be home for dinner. And he'd leave Towson and end up like in York, Pennsylvania, and, grab a ice cream or something and ride back home. And Mom would be like, great. That's just, we were given a lot of rope, in the 70s as kids. And so that kind of feeling of just as a kid, get out on your bike, getting lost for an entire day, riding to the next town and coming back. I did too as a kid. And so I really, felt like a kinship with Bob. And so one of the stories in the book is essentially how Bob founded what he calls the Rando Rambles. More than a decade ago, probably 12 or 13 years ago. And Bob's 53 now, or maybe a few years older. And one of the Rando Rambos is this Mount Vernon to Mount Vernon ride that's really popular. On a good day, and by that I mean like when the sun's out, it's not raining or too cold, it attracts obviously more cyclists. Mm-hmm. And there's been 100 people have done it. So you can imagine 100 people on bikes early in the morning, a Sunday morning, in Mount Vernon on the cobblestones, getting together. It's a lot of fun. And I'll also say, too, Bob might not want me to say this, but some folks take the train back. They ride to D.C. and decide they're going to take the train back, which is fine, of course. I mean, it takes a long time. Everybody has a big lunch down there and does a little tourism thing. And, it's often like getting dark by the time you make it back, especially in this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I have a bicycle, but out where I live here, the hills are so high that it just doesn't make much fun for me to ride a bike from that standpoint. So I really miss that. But lucky you and Rob, you guys are going to live to 122 years old.
Well, it's, as I mentioned earlier, being a bike messenger in D.C. was really like the greatest job I'll ever have. I mean, it was life-changing experience for me to do that and be outside all day long and find such like, childlike joy on a bike, as an adult. I think everybody's like 10 years older the minute they get on a bicycle seat and start pedaling a little bit. Yeah, it's my main form of transportation in the city. I live by Patterson Park. It's pretty flat, southeast Baltimore. I ride up to Hamden and or to West Baltimore. Sometimes there's some hills around to climb, but for the most part, it's my main form of transportation in the city. And I think, to the point of the book a little bit, you just experience the city so much differently when you walk or you bike as opposed to being in a car that's, 2,000-pound piece of metal around you, glass. The windows are up. You don't hear anything. You don't feel the hills in the road like you just said. You don't feel the wind when you go down a hill. You don't feel the potholes. You don't overhear conversations at the stoplights when you stop. You don't. I went for a bike ride the other day, Bob, up to Lake Montebello, just to get some exercise in, enjoy the sunshine a little bit, and I ran into City Councilman Dorsey, and I ran into City Council person, likely elect, and it's just, part of being out in Baltimore. Ovette Ramos from the 12th district, I think, or 14th. She's won the Democratic primary to replace Mary Pat Clark. But I basically ran both of them on my bike, real small Baltimore kind of thing. Riding back towards Patterson Park through Charles Village, Catherine Fahey, who's a terrific artist and makes crankies. If anybody's been to the Cranky Fest at Creative Alliance, they know what crankies are, the little old-fashioned kind of animated pre-movie movies. And she was doing a sidewalk cranky show on one of the stoops, one of the porches in Charles Village. So just the kind of things like you would not run into a city councilman in the car the same way, or run past Catherine Fahey doing a little cranky show on a porch in Charles Village. If you were driving, you just miss those things. And I know you're a muralist. I think you'd miss the great murals in Baltimore. You wouldn't experience them the same way.
That's for sure.
Bicycling around the city is really important to me. I think it's a lot of where these stories end up coming from in the book, in a way.
Well, we're going to share. Will you share with us the Rosy Riveters of the Working Girls on Key Highway, a story you put together for Baltimore Magazine in June 2015?
Rosie the Riveter, I think people know what they are, right? The women who worked in the plants in Baltimore, largely at George Martin Air Force Base, right, where they were making aircrafts then. There was a meeting at an event at the Baltimore Museum of Industry that I attended, and one of the women there was approaching 90 years old, still strong enough to pick up a welding gun, and she had come up from North Carolina as a teenager to work at the Glenn L. Martin Company factory during World War II, and then ended up living with an aunt, and ended up eventually meeting her husband, who was from Essex and was back from the war. Did you want me to read that story, or did you
no? I just wanted to touch on that. We got so many others, but I just wanted to show our listeners, or that our listeners realize, that there's a wide diversity in this book about Baltimore.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about that story was, Grace Henninger was the woman's name. My little story features on is that she met her future husband home on leave while he was shopping. Well, they were both shopping at the Essex A&P. They married, after 6 weeks of dating, 70 years ago at this point. And after his discharge, they bought a little 4-room house that had been initially intended as temporary housing for plant workers in Victory Villa, which was a small development near Glen Martin, temporary housing for the plant workers, a development where streets were given names like Fuselage Avenue, Altimeter Court, and they spent their lives there. They raised 5 children there. They kept making renovations over the years to the house, right? Adding on another bedroom, putting a new oil furnace in. And Grace eventually went back to work, working on the assembly line at Westinghouse 20 years after her children had grown. And, she was telling me her story. Her husband had passed in 1999 from colon cancer from asbestos that he'd gotten where he worked at Bethlehem Steel. And, she still lived in that house. And, it was, I think, what was extraordinary kind of for me was picturing her, 90 years old and then 70 years in that house, raising 5 children, all the birthdays there, all the graduations, all the dinners, all the family dinners, her husband, the 5 kids. And, she's essentially still living in the plant house for workers there. All those memories still in that house that she lived in at 90 years old.
Wow.
Really, really remarkable, woman. Yeah.
Well, there are other remarkable women. And Baltimore once had a Playboy club on Light Street. I beg your pardon, Laura, you're saying something. Oh, she's telling me we got to tease and then have a break here, and then I'll come back to the story. That's what happens when you have a boss. You just can't run around on your bicycle and ride anywhere you want. So we're going to take a break right here with our guest, Ron Cassie. If you love Baltimore, it will love you back. 171 short but true stories, Apprentice House 2020, available on Amazon or over at www.roncassie.com.
Hi, this is Roseanne Cash, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
I have very seldom enjoyed an interview this much.
Oh, really?
Very seldom.
Well, ditto. Yeah, ditto. We had one heck of a good time there partying on the radio. There they go. Are you with us, Ron?
Yes, of course.
Okay, here goes now. Baltimore once had a Playboy Club on Light Street. Take us back 50 years and introduce us to Sharon Bernstein Payton. I think I may have danced with her at the Baltimore club called the Blue Set. Remember the Blue Set?
I do not remember the Blue Set. That's a little before my time.
Oh.
But I know of it. Yeah, a couple of Sharon mentioned the Blue Set to me when I was working on this story a few years ago. Yeah, Baltimore had a Playboy Club on Light Street. It had a pretty good run for the period, mid early 60s to mid early 70s. For Baltimore, it was kind of a big deal. Blue collar city. It had a touch of glamour. I think when the New York Yankees or the New York Jets came into town, the ball players would go there, and there was an entertainer or something like that. They'd end up there. I think one of the interesting things. The club was in Baltimore from 64 to 77. I think one of the interesting things about it was interviewing the women who worked there, who obviously understood the chauvinism and everything else about it. But for a lot of the women who worked there, what they shared to me was that it was an empowering place. There wasn't a lot of jobs available for women without a college education, or women with a college education at that point, to go out and earn some really good money, which they did make at the Playboy Club. And a lot of them were pushing the boundaries of kind of like what was acceptable, it was a daring thing to do in some ways, become a Playboy bunny at that point. And almost all the women I talked to, none of them regretted the experience at all. They got to meet a lot of famous people. They were young. They made some good money, and a lot of them gained some experience working with the public that they carried on to other things in their lives. And I think it's easy to look back and say, oh, it was just a chauvinistic place to work, and not talking to the women who actually work. Talking to the women who actually worked there, you get a little bit different take on the story.
For sure. And I was, when you mentioned they met another higher class of people when they went there, and that certainly is always helpful for a young woman in that kind of situation.
Yeah, it was fun. Flip Wilson, Richard Pryor would perform there often. You had Jerry Val and Al Martino singing. And so, it was fun. It was a lively place to work. They made more money than working at a diner in Baltimore somewhere. They participated in parades and charity golf outings and went to, Walter Reed to visit the troops and things like that. So for a lot of them, it was fun, empowering, and not going to be their life's work, but they put up with being hassled and things like that. But they understood. I mean, the women I talked to, at least, they were taking the bad with the good, which they thought, for a lot of them as very young women, it got them, a salary, some real money where they could go on and do other things eventually. And it wasn't boring either, which anybody who's worked for a living knows that it can be, earning a paycheck can be a tedious affair sometimes.
It sure can. Well, but then there is the hero named Ralph Brown, who decided to do something about the large number of black children dying in swimming pools because no one taught them how to swim. What did Ralph Brown do about this?
Well, it's an interesting story. I'll just explain a little bit how I came on to Ralph Brown a little bit. I was, as I said, I ride my bike around a lot. I'm often writing a couple of these for the magazine a week, little kind of vignettes, little kind of off the radar stories of Baltimore. And I went on a bicycle tour initially with Baltimore Heritage to West Baltimore, and you never know who you're going to meet. That's one of the fun things about Baltimore too, right? I signed up with Baltimore Heritage to go on a little bike tour of West Baltimore, and it was actually a tour, if I remember correctly, of Black and Jewish Baltimore, where the two communities overlap, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s when those neighborhoods in West Baltimore were changing. And you never know who you're going to meet in Baltimore. And one of the fellows along on the bike ride was a pediatrician named Ralph Brown. And one of the first stops on the bike tour was Druid Park.
My favorite park.
Yeah, beautiful, enormous, gorgeous. And one of the first places we stopped on the bike tour was the old, what was referred to as the colored swimming pool in West Baltimore. And it's now essentially an art installation that Joyce Scott created there, filling this what was once the colored swimming pool in segregated Baltimore with dirt and grass, and kind of making it into a monument, a memorial. It's kind of really beautiful if people go up to Druid Park to see that. Joyce Scott, of course, one of America's greatest living artists, still lives in West Baltimore. But like I said, along the way over there, Ralph Brown, pediatrician's on the bike, and he had worked at Sinai Hospital almost his entire career, and so he's meeting a lot of children through his practice.
Whoa.
And what he saw was that nearly all the white kids in his Sinai Hospital practice learned to swim by the age 7 or 8, but this was not the case with African American families. And he was embarrassed to admit, he said, it did not register what that meant until he saw a CDC report, probably about 10 years ago at this point, that black children are 5 times more likely to drown than white kids. And the connection, of course, is to the colored swimming pool is, for a long time, African Americans, black kids and adults were not allowed to swim in white swimming pools. They were denied access. And simply, if your parents don't swim, if your grandparents didn't swim, your great-grandparents swim, you're less likely to end up in a swimming pool and getting lessons as a kid. And this is what contributes essentially to this, extraordinary higher death rate from drowning. And so he, Ralph Brown, after he learned what that meant, that kids didn't know how to swim in his practice, he started, making sure, following up with his parents, that they were learning how to swim. And that story, as is so often the case, led me to this other story, that there's a father and son team. The father is now deceased. Marvin Thorpe the second and Marvin Thorpe the third have taught more than 15,000, almost all kids, to swim at their Woodlawn backyard swimming pool, and just over the line outside the Beltway.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So that I heard about them from Ralph Brown. So Ralph Brown, during this little bike ride, mentioned the Thorpes to me, that this father and son team had been teaching kids to swim, mostly black kids, to swim for, decades at this point in their backyard swimming pool. And it's still going. I mean, if you Google Marvin Thorpe, you will come probably to my story, but you'll also come up to the website where you can next summer get your kids swimming lessons. His father has passed, but the younger Mr. Thorpe, who's in his 50s, continues the tradition. And they were doing it once they were able to this summer with proper protocols for COVID. And a lot of famous Baltimoreans have learned how to swim through that. So
that's precious. This whole that's really for people to do that, and especially when there's so, with the way this country is divided right now, the way we're beginning to see just how terrible people of color have been treated and have continued to be. Well, before we run out of too much time here, we got one more time we can, one more question I can throw in before we have to stop this hour. Share with us your story, Brush with Life, about portrait painter Kimberly Sheridan. Now, she doesn't sell her work, but instead she offers her paintings to the victims for free. How did this come about?
I had heard of Kimberly Sheridan's work. I can't remember exactly where, but I was weirdly doing another event, a panel discussion as a senior editor of Baltimore Magazine. And Kimberly was in the audience, and she came up to me afterwards to say hello. And I knew who she was right away. I knew her story, that she paints portrait of victims of gun violence in Baltimore.
Yes,
and I had heard her name, and when she introduced me, all my little light bells went off that I've been meaning to reach out to her for so long and do this story. And I was so happy to see her, and so made arrangements to go over to her Pigtown Row house. And, she's really a remarkable woman who puts so much of her own life aside to paint these portraits of victims of gun violence. And she shares them then with the family members of the victims of gun violence. It's an act of, I know you're an artist, Bob, it's an act of healing for Kimberly, who has lost her best friend to gun violence in the city. Many, many years ago. And, I think like a lot of us in the city, thinks about gun violence almost every day, impacts her. And she cares about, people in just a fulsome and compassionate and natural way. And this is, her, a combination of her art and also just healing for herself to do this work. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, one of her first paintings was of a young boy, maybe 3 years old, who was shot a stray bullet while he was getting his first haircut in Pigtown. Yeah, not far from where she lives. And this is what she had lost her best friend a few years earlier, and it was a young boy named James who was 3 years old. On his third birthday, 1997, at a barbershop near her home, had been shot in the head and killed as he waited for his mother to get essentially get his first haircut. And she was just distraught, and these paintings are a way of herself to to deal with this and help heal the city as well. I mean, people are, as you can imagine, extraordinarily grateful when they when she contacts them and she finds a photograph that she can paint from and present it to the family. And I think, like, I don't want to throw our governor under the bus, but our governor has said, he thinks people in Baltimore don't care enough about gun violence or don't do enough. And I think
he's dead wrong about that.
He's dead wrong, right? Yeah. And this is she's just one example, I think, of people who are really profoundly impacted about the violence in the city on a personal level.
Through the pain that she went through in her losses.
Yeah.
She's taken that pain, and instead of feeling miserable for herself the rest of her life, she decides to give joy to others by, how many people have a portrait of themselves? Do you realize that's not something that most people in blue-collar houses or no-collar houses have? And that's an extraordinary thing to have that for free. And it's so kind. Kindness is something we are truly lacking for the last 4 years. And hopefully it'll change greatly soon.
Yeah, of course, many of these victims are young. They're high school football players and young adults, and they don't have portraits. I mean, they often don't have great portrait photographs, let alone somebody taking the time to create a portrait painting that's meaningful. She's really a remarkable woman.
How old is she about now?
I think maybe Kimberly maybe 60 at this point. I think she maybe was 58 when I did the story, somewhere thereabouts. I'm just realizing it's only about a year and a half ago when I did the story. She's she lives very modestly, and she puts everything she has into this. And she's displayed some of the works here and there, and I know she's hoping to, maybe she has by this point, created a nonprofit and trying to partner with other anti-violence and family survivor organizations.
Well, we got to stop right here, but thank you for doing that. That's what this book is so important for. You're introducing Baltimoreans to Baltimoreans who are doing things for each other, making sure that we can work things out rather than putting one group of people against another group, which unfortunately our country has done for a long time. We're going to take our break right now on 21st Century Radio, and we'll be back in about 5 or 6 minutes. And we'll have more Baltimore stories like Coming Clean, what you learned about Baltimore's squeegee kids.
For the kids.